At midnight, his phone rang and the voice of his wife cut through the dark, crying that she had been robbed and dumped 120 miles from home. He drove like a madman, and when he arrived she was huddled against a cold brick wall, trembling in the snow. But the knife in the heart was not the cold night. It was the truth that his own son David and David's wife had thrown her away like trash. Rage burned deeper than the frost, and that night he swore this betrayal would never be forgiven. Subscribe now and drop a simple number or where you're watching from before you hear what he did next. The phone nearly slipped from his hand when he heard her voice. In 30 years together he had weathered storms, sickness, arguments, and the silence of grief. But he had never heard Helen sound like this. Every word trembled, every breath carried the weight of terror, as if she were fading on the other end of the line. He didn't stop to think. He grabbed his coat, the keys jangling with urgency, and bolted through the front door. The night air bit at his skin, sharp and merciless, but it was nothing compared to the ice in his chest. The truck roared to life, and he tore down the empty road, headlights carving through darkness like knives. The miles stretched endlessly, highway markers glowing like cruel reminders of the distance between him and the woman who had once been the center of every holiday, every birthday, every memory that mattered. He pushed harder on the gas, the engine growling as if it shared his fury. Her words replayed in his mind, fragments that refused to settle. Abandoned, robbed, cold. Please help. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly the leather bit into his palms. He kept glancing at the passenger seat, imagining her there, shivering, her eyes wide with a fear he had never seen. The farther he drove, the more the silence pressed in, broken only by the wind whipping across the hood and the low whine of the tires on cracked asphalt. He imagined her alone under a flickering neon light at some forgotten station, breath clouding in the freezing air, wondering if he would come. That thought alone stoked a fire in his chest, a fury that drowned out exhaustion, distance, reason. Nothing mattered except getting to her before the cold swallowed what was left of her strength. When he finally turned onto the narrow road that led to Miller's Corner, the headlights caught the outline of the gas station, desolate, a lonely beacon in the dark. His stomach twisted. The place looked abandoned, the sign half lit. The snow piled against the walls. He spotted her instantly, a fragile figure pressed against the bricks, arms wrapped tight around herself as if trying to hold her body together. Even from the truck he could see her shaking. Her gray hair was tangled, her face pale, her jacket far too thin for the February air. He killed the engine and ran, boots slipping on ice, but he didn't care. Her eyes met his, and for a split second he saw the truth. Fear, betrayal, and something worse, resignation, as if she had stopped expecting to be saved. He caught her before she collapsed, her body cold enough to make his teeth clench. She whispered his name like a prayer, and he realized then that the snow and the night weren't the true enemies. What haunted her came from closer to home, from blood and kin, and it was waiting for him just beyond this moment. The road stretched out like an endless black ribbon, every broken line flashing beneath his headlights as if mocking his desperation. The heater blasted at full strength, but the cabin still felt like ice. He leaned forward over the wheel, eyes locked on the horizon, as though sheer willpower could drag him closer to her. The speedometer climbed, but the miles crawled. Each green highway sign announcing the next exit was another reminder of how far she was, and how easily she could slip away in the time it took him to reach her. He pressed harder on the gas, the engine groaning in protest, the steering wheel vibrating beneath his grip. He knew these roads well, had driven them hundreds of times, but tonight they felt foreign, hostile. Snow flurries swirled in his high beams, streaking across the windshield like phantom hands clawing at the glass. The wipers slapped furiously, smearing ice into streaks that blurred his view. He cursed under his breath and leaned in closer, his knuckles bone white against the wheel. Every second mattered, every delay another chance for the cold to steal what warmth was left in her. His mind betrayed him with visions. Helen slumped against a wall, her lips turning blue, her eyes closing as the frost crept deeper into her bones. The thought tightened his chest until breathing felt like punishment. He gritted his teeth and pushed it down, But the image kept returning sharper each time, as though his worst fear was being rehearsed by the night itself. He rolled down the window for a breath of biting air, hoping it would clear his head. Instead, the wind cut his face raw, and he slammed the glass back up, muttering that he had to hold it together. The loneliness of the highway grew heavier with every passing mile. No other cars, no headlights in the distance, just the steady hum of his tires and the whisper of the storm. It felt like he was driving through a void, a tunnel with no end. His thoughts spiraled. What if her phone had already died? What if she had wandered away from the station, desperate to find warmth? What if she was lying there now in the snow, hidden from the road, her body sinking into silence before he ever arrived? He shook his head violently, trying to drive those thoughts out, but they clung to him, suffocating. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it above the engine. The clock on the dashboard mocked him, every minute stretched thin as glass. He pressed harder on the pedal, the truck lunging forward, the wind screaming louder against the frame. His entire body ached with the need to see her alive, to feel the heat of her skin, to know that he hadn't been too late. And just as the road bent into the dark stretch before Miller's Corner, a flicker of neon broke through the storm. A faint light, distant but real. His pulse kicked like a hammer in his chest. He knew she was near, but he also knew this light would reveal more than just his wife. What waited for him there was not just a rescue, but the first step into a betrayal so deep it would leave scars on every mile that lay ahead. The truck skidded slightly as he pulled into the empty lot, tires crunching on frozen gravel. His headlights washed over the station, half the sign flickering, the rest swallowed by darkness. Then he saw her. Helen was pressed against the wall like a shadow carved from ice, arms wrapped around herself, shivering so violently it looked like her bones might splinter. The jacket on her shoulders was little more than a rag against the February night. Her face was colorless, lips cracked, and when her eyes met his, they carried a terror that didn't belong to strangers or accidents. It was the kind of fear that comes only from betrayal. He bolted from the truck, his breath catching in the air like smoke from a fire, and ran toward her. Her body collapsed into his arms the moment he reached her, frail and cold as stone. He held her close, trying to will his warmth into her, but even through the layers of his coat he felt how the night had drained her. Her fingers clutched his shirt like she was afraid he might vanish too, and for a moment he almost broke, almost let the rage that was clawing inside him spill out. But she needed calm, not fury. Her voice was no louder than the wind when she spoke his name. It was raw, cracked, almost unbelieving that he had come. His throat tightened as he whispered back, asking what had happened, who had done this. She shook her head, tears freezing before they could fall, and clung tighter. He led her to the truck, guiding each step, terrified that if he let go for even a second she might collapse completely. The door creaked open. The heater blasted, and still she shook, as though the cold had rooted itself into her veins. He studied her face under the glow of the dashboard light and saw something that cut deeper than frostbite. It wasn't just fear. It was the hollow look of someone cast aside by blood, stripped of worth by the very people she had trusted most. That truth hit him harder than the storm outside. This wasn't misfortune. This was deliberate cruelty. As he wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, she finally found the strength to speak. Her words came broken, but each one drove deeper than the last. The keys taken. The door slammed. His own son's voice telling her she was no longer welcome. The rage he had held back on the drive roared alive in his chest, hot and merciless. He swallowed it down for her sake, but he knew in that instant the night had shifted. He brushed the snow from her hair, promising her she was safe now, but inside his mind was already moving faster than the wheels that would carry them home. What his son had done was more than a betrayal. It was a declaration of war, and by dawn he would know exactly how to answer it. Inside the truck, the heater roared, but it could not thaw the chill that clung to her body. He watched her chest rise and fall, shallow and uneven, her eyes flickering with the weight of something she didn't want to say. His hand tightened on the steering wheel, veins standing out as he demanded softly but firmly to know what had happened. For a long moment she only stared out at the desolate gas pumps, the snow piling in drifts around them, lips trembling as though every word carried a blade. When it finally came, her voice broke into shards. It wasn't strangers. It wasn't thieves. It was David, their own son, and Melissa at his side. The words detonated in the cab. He blinked, stunned, the syllables refusing to settle into sense. David, his boy, the child he had raised through scraped knees and restless nights, the man he had watched marry with pride in his heart. He shook his head slowly, as if disbelief alone could erase it, but Helen's eyes were already wet with shame. She explained in fractured bursts the argument over money, the cruel accusations, the way Melissa's smile twisted as she dangled Helen's car keys and said she didn't belong there anymore. The fury rose fast, hotter than the engine, thick in his throat and pounding in his temples. He gripped the wheel until it groaned beneath his hands, fighting the urge to slam his fist through the glass. His son had not only rejected his mother, but thrown her into the night like garbage. That image tore at him, a wound deeper than any blade could cut. His breath came ragged, the fury crawling through his veins, demanding release. Yet beside him sat Helen, fragile and wounded, and he forced himself to hold still, to stay anchored for her. Her words spilled further, and with each sentence his chest tightened. David had told her she was nothing but dead weight. Melissa had stood behind him, arms crossed, enjoying every second. Together they had locked the door, left her stranded, without money, without warmth, stripped of dignity by the people she had once trusted with everything. The betrayal was so complete it felt like the air had been sucked from the cab. He turned to her eyes, burning with a mix of grief and fire, and swore under his breath that this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. If his son wanted to treat his own mother as an enemy, then he would learn what it meant to provoke a father who had sacrificed everything. He touched Helen's hand, grounding himself in the only promise that mattered now. She would never face this kind of night again. But as the truck rumbled back onto the highway, the rage in his chest no longer asked for patience. It demanded retribution. And soon David and Melissa would understand that some betrayals do not go unanswered. The road unspooled beneath the tires, white lines flashing by in relentless rhythm. But his mind was fixed on her trembling words. She sat in the passenger seat, clutching the blanket around her shoulders, eyes darting as if afraid the confession itself might conjure more demons. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, heavy, with the weight of secrets long buried. She told him about the inheritance, an estate worth nearly $800,000 of property left untouched since her parents passed, and stock certificates that had gathered dust in a lockbox yet held the value of entire lifetimes. His jaw tightened, the muscles in his face twitching as he processed it. For decades they had shared a home, raised a son, carried each other through loss and laughter, yet she had kept this truth hidden. He wanted to interrupt, to demand why, but the look in her eyes stopped him cold. It wasn't greed that had silenced her all these years. It was fear, the kind that eats at trust until silence feels like the only safe choice. Helen explained that David had stumbled upon a letter while sorting through old boxes in the attic. It mentioned the property, the accounts, the locked drawer she thought no one would ever open. Once he knew, everything shifted. At first he asked questions with a false sweetness, the kind of tone that tried to mask calculation. Then came accusations, sharp and bitter, that she was hoarding what was rightfully his. He called it his future, as if his parents were nothing but stepping stones toward an inheritance. The father gripped the wheel, harder fury mixing with a cold, stinging disbelief. His son had not only cast his mother into the night, but had done so with the arrogance of a thief, convinced the blood in his veins gave him entitlement to wealth he had not earned. The thought of Melissa whispering in his ear, encouraging the greed, tightened his chest even further. Helen's hands shook as she described the final confrontation. David's voice had grown louder, more venomous, until Melissa stood beside him with her arms folded, pressing the demand. They told her the house should already be in their name, the stocks liquidated, the money redirected. When she resisted, David's temper exploded. That was when the keys were taken, when the door was slammed, when the night swallowed her whole. The father's breath came hard, his vision narrowing on the road ahead. Every mile forward was another stitch in a plan forming inside his mind. He could forgive silence, even fear, but what David had done crossed a line carved deep into bone. Betrayal of a parent is an unforgivable wound, and this inheritance was no longer a hidden fortune. It was the weapon that would turn the tide. He said nothing more as the lights of the city appeared on the horizon. But his silence was not emptiness. It was fire contained, waiting for the moment to erupt. What David thought was his future would soon become his downfall. The silence inside the truck thickened until it felt like a third presence pressing down on them both. He kept his eyes fixed on the road, but every word Helen had just spoken sliced into him. She hadn't only hidden the inheritance from their son, she had hidden it from him as well. Decades of marriage, of trust, built through storms and sweat, and she had carried this secret alone. The weight of it throbbed in his chest, a betrayal that stung almost as sharply as the cruelty their son had shown. Yet he could not let that wound consume him, not while she sat beside him, still trembling from the night's ordeal. Helen's voice faltered as she revealed more. When David uncovered the truth, it was Melissa who twisted the knife. She had whispered venom into his ear, feeding his anger, convincing him that Helen's silence was proof of deceit. Together they accused her of clinging to wealth that should already belong to them, insisting she was selfish, untrustworthy, a woman who valued strangers over her own blood. The words had cut deeper than any winter wind. The father gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles pale against the leather. His mind reeled between the ache of betrayal and the blaze of fury. His wife had kept him in the dark, but the greater crime lay with his son. Blood of his blood, who had chosen greed over loyalty, venom over gratitude. And Melissa, standing at his side, her eyes gleaming with triumph, had made herself executioner of the bond between parent and child. Helen tried to explain that fear had driven her silence, that she had only wanted to protect the family from division. But the irony was cruel. In hiding the inheritance, she had planted the very seed that now poisoned them. David saw himself not as a son robbed of kindness, but as a victim robbed of property, as though love and sacrifice were worthless beside dollar signs. The father's heart thundered with a mix of grief and wrath. He thought of nights spent working overtime, of the mortgage payments scraped together, of the pride he had felt watching David take his first steps, his first job, his first vows as a man. All of it now reduced to a ledger in his son's mind, as if family were nothing more than a transaction. He forced himself to breathe the taste of metal sharp in his mouth. There would be time to face Helen's silence, to reconcile the fracture between them. But the betrayal that came from his son, from the woman David had chosen, would not be ignored. It was one thing to carry secrets. It was another to weaponize them. As the truck carried them closer to home, his resolve hardened. What David believed was his rightful claim would soon become the very rope that unraveled him. And before the night gave way to dawn, the father would decide just how far he was willing to go to teach his son the cost of betrayal. When they returned home, the walls themselves seemed to lean in heavy with silence. The house that once held birthdays and Christmas mornings now carried only shadows of those memories, hollowed out by truths that could not be buried again. He sat at the edge of the table, the wood scarred by years of family meals, and felt the weight of a fracture that could not be unseen. Helen lingered in the hallway, her eyes avoiding his, while upstairs the echo of David's absence rang louder than footsteps ever could. Security, the very thing an inheritance was meant to provide, had twisted into poison, seeping into every corner of their lives. He tried to recall the home as it had been, a sanctuary built from long shifts, saved dollars, sacrifices neither of them had ever questioned. Now the air was brittle, every glance sharp with suspicion. Helen's silence gnawed at him, the hidden fortune, a betrayal that still stung. But what burned deeper was David's greed, the entitlement etched into his son's words, as if love and blood were debts to be collected. The father felt like a man stranded between two collapsing walls, his wife on one side with her secrets, his son on the other with his hunger, and himself trapped in the wreckage of both. At night the house was colder, the furnace humming but unable to chase away the chill that had nothing to do with winter. Helen slept fitfully, murmuring apologies into the dark, but he lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every choice that had brought them here. He remembered teaching David how to ride a bike on the cracked pavement out front, remembered holding Helen's hand when they signed their first mortgage, remembered the feeling of pride when they thought the family was unshakable. Each memory now felt tainted, rewritten by betrayal. The neighbors noticed, too. Questions slipped through in polite tones. Why had Helen looked so pale? Why did David's car leave in anger last week? Why did the house seem so quiet? He brushed them off with forced smiles, but inside he felt the fracture widening, threatening to swallow everything whole. This was no longer just a dispute over property or money. It was a cancer that had spread into trust itself. He caught Helen once standing at the kitchen window, staring out as if expecting David to come home and make it right. But the father knew better. There was no mending what had been shattered. Love had been traded for leverage, loyalty for entitlement, and now every breath in the house carried the taste of betrayal. He clenched his fists beneath the table, a man torn between the instinct to protect what remained and the rising fury that demanded retribution. The fracture was no longer hidden. It was carved deep into the heart of their family. And as he watched the night swallow their home in silence, he knew the next move would determine whether the cracks consumed them or became the weapon he would use to strike back. The breaking point came not with shouting, but with papers. A thick envelope slid across the table, its weight heavier than any words his son could have spoken. Inside lay drafts of legal filings, threats dressed up in polished language and official stamps. David's voice carried a sharpness that did not belong to him, a rehearsed tone fed by Melissa and sharpened by her parents' ambition. They wanted signatures, transfers, the inheritance carved into their possession like a prize already won. It was no longer family against itself. It was family weaponized by outsiders, and the battlefield had been dragged straight into their home. The father stared at the pages, the ink blurring as rage surged in his chest. Lawyers, accusations, words that treated Helen not as a mother, but as an obstacle. He had seen plenty of conflict in his life, but never imagined he would face his own son across a line drawn in courtrooms and contracts. The betrayal had matured into something colder, more strategic, its roots tangled in greed and manipulation. Helen's hands trembled as she reached for the papers, her face drained of what little strength remained. She had always believed blood could overcome bitterness, that no son of hers could cut this deep. But here it was undeniable, written in legal threats and deadlines. David didn't look at her when he spoke, only at the documents, as though she had already ceased to exist. Melissa sat at his side, her lips curled into the faintest smile, her parents looming in the background like shadows who had orchestrated every step. The father's heart pounded as he listened, his mind catching every poisoned word. They claimed she had deceived them, that withholding the inheritance was fraud, that the law was on their side. Each accusation was another blade slicing deeper, daring him to respond. He clenched his fists beneath the table, fighting the urge to tear the papers to shreds then and there. But he knew that fury alone would not win this war. Strategy would. The silence that followed was suffocating. He looked at his son and saw not the boy he had raised, but a stranger molded by greed. It was a cruel transformation, and one that left scars no court ruling could ever erase. Still, he forced himself to breathe, to think beyond the ache of betrayal. He could not fight rage with rage. He had to outmaneuver them, use every ounce of resolve, every hidden card, to turn this trap against them. When David and Melissa left, the door closing like the final note of a sentence, the father sat in the dim kitchen light, his pulse steadying into something colder than anger. It was no longer a question of family or forgiveness. The war had been declared, and he would meet it on his own terms. The time for silence was over. The time for retaliation had begun, and the strike he was planning would cut deeper than any paper threat. He sat alone in the dark kitchen after they left, the envelope of legal threats still on the table, like a viper coiled and waiting to strike. The silence of the house pressed in on him, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the uneven rhythm of his own breath. His hands were steady now, no longer trembling with rage, but firm with purpose. Betrayal had scorched him raw, yet from the ashes came clarity. No son of his would cast his mother into the snow and walk away unpunished. Not while he still drew breath. He rose slowly, the chair scraping against the floorboards, his shadow stretching long across the kitchen wall. Every step he took toward the study felt deliberate, each one hammering a vow deeper into the marrow of his bones. He opened the desk drawer and pulled out files he had kept locked away for years: deeds, savings records, insurance papers. If David wanted to turn the family into a battlefield, then the father would arm himself not just with anger, but with proof, with leverage, with the cold precision of a man who refused to lose. In the quiet of that room, he began to map out his next move. He would not beg. He would not explain. He would confront his son face to face, strip away the lies Melissa and her parents had fed him, and force him to see the man he was standing against. No courtroom could shake the truth of a father who had sacrificed everything to build this life, only to have it spit back in his face. Helen appeared in the doorway, her eyes weary but searching. He told her simply that it was over the shame, the silence, the endless waiting for their son to return to reason. From now on they would act, not endure. She nodded, a single tear cutting down her cheek, but behind her sorrow was relief. For the first time since that night in the snow, she saw not just her husband, but her protector, the man who had once promised her safety, and now renewed that promise with fire in his eyes. As dawn crept over the horizon, the father stood at the window watching the pale light bleed into the yard. The war his son had chosen would not be fought with shouting or empty threats. It would be fought with resolve, with strategy, with the unwavering strength of a man who had built his life from nothing and would not see it stolen by greed. He knew the path ahead would cut deep, leaving scars across every bond they once held, but he no longer hesitated. No one abandoned his wife and walked away whole, not strangers, not enemies, and certainly not his own blood. The time had come to face David, and when that door closed between them, only one man would walk out holding the future. Betrayal within a family cuts deeper than any wound from the outside world, but this story reminds us of something crucial. Silence and secrets can destroy trust just as quickly as greed and entitlement. For older generations, the lesson is clear. Our sacrifices, our savings, our legacy must never be taken for granted, and they should never be hidden away in fear. Transparency, courage, and setting firm boundaries are essential even with those we love most. At the same time, dignity is not something that can be stolen by betrayal. It is reclaimed through resilience by standing tall when others expect you to crumble. For anyone who has felt abandoned, used, or dismissed by those closest to them, the message is simple but powerful. You are stronger than the betrayal, and your worth is not defined by others' greed. Family is built on love and respect, and when that bond is broken, we must still protect our own hearts, our partners, and our dignity. If this story resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and drop a comment, whether it's your age, your state, or just a number, so we know you're here with us. Your voice matters.